The sun shone brightly on the centuries-old royal palace, its sprawling grounds a testament to the kingdom's storied history. Yet the lavish illumination did little to quell the subtle current of unease that flickered beneath the surface, a sensation that would only grow stronger with each passing moment as a wealthy foreign tourist arrived in a sleek black limousine. He was dressed in the finest bespoke suit, complete with golden cufflinks bearing his family crest, and he wore a subtle smirk that suggested he owned not only his immediate surroundings, but also the hearts of those who gazed upon him, a notion that quickly became an undercurrent of tension among the crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the famed royal guard. The palace itself, renowned for its ornate turrets and gilded archways, had stood for centuries as a beacon of regal power, and the imposing marble columns lining the grand courtyard were meant to remind every visitor, rich or otherwise, of the monarchy's far-reaching legacy, inspiring a mixture of awe and humility among those who walked its halls. Yet for this particular tourist, whose fortune spanned continents and whose sense of entitlement was just as vast, the meticulously polished floors and meticulously trimmed hedges were less a space to revere and more a canvas upon which he wished to display his own significance. As he stepped from his limousine, flanked by two personal assistants carrying luxurious leather briefcases, he barely acknowledged the neatly arranged rows of rose bushes and manicured lawns that stretched toward the horizon, too absorbed in his own self-importance to appreciate the subtle scents of jasmine and lavender drifting gently on the breeze, an aroma that usually lulled visitors into a serene reverence for the historic grandeur they were about to witness. With a casual flick of his wrist, he summoned a palace tour guide who approached him hesitantly, the guide's posture revealing both deep respect for the palace protocols and an instinctual trepidation at the tourist's commanding air, which suggested that any misstep on the part of a subordinate might be met with swift and public reproach. Even as visitors from all over the world gathered in excited clusters around official signage displaying rules for decorum, photography restrictions, directives on standing distance from guards, and guidelines on respectful conduct, the wealthy tourist seemed almost amused by the notion of restraint, as though these rules were meant for those of lesser means, and not for someone whose bank statements likely rivaled the smaller kingdoms of the world. Upon making his way past the initial security checkpoint, an ornate wrought-iron gate that bore the crest of the royal family in shimmering gold, the tourist paused momentarily, scanning the courtyard with narrowed eyes, as if evaluating the statuary and architectural details to ensure they met his refined standards, before exhaling in mild satisfaction and proceeding forward in a measured, almost theatrical gait. He made certain that every subtle glance directed his way was met with a carefully crafted expression of practiced confidence, occasionally lifting his chin in a gesture designed to convey the belief that he was the most significant individual in attendance, regardless of the presence of dignitaries, fellow aristocrats, or any other figure of importance. The Royal Guard, standing in their impeccable uniforms of deep cerulean and gleaming silver accents, commanded a dignified silence that had long captivated onlookers, their stillness an art form passed down through generations, and yet today, behind their stoic facades, there existed an imperceptible tension, as though they sensed the approach of someone who might disrupt the equilibrium they so tirelessly maintained. Tourists generally treated these guards with utmost reverence, respecting their unwavering discipline and acknowledging the centuries of royal tradition embodied in their every stance. But on this day, one could feel a peculiar charge in the air, as if something about this new arrival was poised to upset the carefully curated atmosphere of respect and admiration. Carefully crossing the palace courtyard, the tourist noticed the hush that fell whenever he drew near, and he seemed to relish this involuntary deference, interpreting it as an unspoken acknowledgement of his influence rather than the cautious respect born from an environment steeped in formal tradition. His footsteps clicked sharply on the polished stones, resonating with a self-assured cadence that spoke volumes of his personal conviction that power was an inherent right rather than an earned privilege. The mosaic tiles under his feet depicted scenes of heroic conquest from the kingdom's legendary past. Knights and warriors locked in eternal battle with mythical beasts. Yet these grand stories of honor and bravery appeared to pass entirely unnoticed by the man, whose gaze drifted instead toward the onlookers, momentarily gauging the effect of his presence upon them. Meanwhile, the royal guard maintained their statuesque composure along the perimeter, each one trained not to flinch or react, no matter the spectacle unfolding around them, as the kingdom prided itself on a level of discipline and decorum that transcended time and circumstance. Curious whispers began to spread among the crowd, fueling speculation about the identity of the visitor. Some believed he was an eccentric billionaire with plans to donate to the kingdom's philanthropic ventures, while others suspected he was simply another arrogant magnate, come to flaunt his wealth in a place revered for its ancient traditions and unyielding moral codes. Still, few doubted that this man's arrival boded a shift in the day's atmosphere, and the onlookers couldn't help but feel a strange apprehension, as if collectively holding their breath in anticipation of some dramatic turn. As the tourist advanced deeper into the palace grounds, he passed a series of bronze sculptures honouring past monarchs, each intricately etched with inscriptions celebrating the prosperity their rule had brought. Yet not once did he pause to reflect upon these long-departed figures. Instead, he cast only a cursory glance at the polished metal, then turned away, continuing his proud march toward the grand staircase that led inside. In the corridor beyond, vaulted ceilings soared overhead, painted with vibrant frescoes depicting celestial beings guiding the realm to its destiny. But the tourist barely raised his head to marvel at the artistry, seeming more concerned with ensuring that his meticulously tailored attire remained free from even the slightest crease. The low murmur of hushed conversation and the faint echo of footsteps across marble surfaces accented the vastness of the space. And for most visitors, this moment of entering the palace was humbling, a reminder of how small they were in comparison to the weight of history housed within these walls. However, to this wealthy traveller, it was simply another grand stage to dominate, another opportunity to assert his importance. At one point, a timid palace staff member approached to offer a welcome, extending a respectful greeting that had been meticulously scripted to honour the monarchy's gracious hospitality. Yet the tourist waved the staffer off without so much as a nod, seemingly more annoyed at the interruption than appreciative of the courtesy. In that fleeting exchange, a cluster of nearby guests exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing the potential for friction between a man so assured of his own status and a royal environment that brooked no disrespect toward its guardians or traditions. The atmosphere grew heavier still when the tourist's personal assistants busied themselves with whispered tasks, glancing nervously about as though they were aware their employer's haughty manner could attract negative attention, and they tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to divert him with gentle suggestions that they continue onward to meet their official escort. The official escort, a polished representative of the palace, awaited them near the threshold leading into the Hall of Ancestors, a massive chamber lined with ancestral portraits and centuries-old armour displayed in glass cases, ready to expound upon the palace's storied past. Despite the escort's courteous tone and offers of historical anecdotes, the tourist seemed disinterested, checking the time on his gold-plated watch and making idle remarks about how he'd already seen enough old buildings to last a lifetime, eliciting a soft gasp from a few older visitors who overheard his dismissive words. This reaction, though subtle, was telling. It underscored just how jarring the tourist's demeanour was in a place where respect, humility, and admiration were practically woven into the tapestry of daily life, both among citizens and travellers alike. Yet, if the tourist noticed the gentle rebuke in the hush that settled over the corridor, he showed no sign of acknowledging it, continuing instead to stride forward with an air of entitlement so unwavering it bordered on the theatrical. Outside, in the courtyard, the Royal Guard continued their silent watch, rifles held at precise angles, faces trained in an unflinching gaze into the distance, each guard performing the same ritual they had practiced from the moment they first donned the uniform, a symbol of unwavering loyalty to the crown. Observing them out of the corner of his eye, the tourist smirked slightly, as though amused by the formality of their stances, oblivious, or perhaps simply indifferent, to the depth of history and discipline underpinning their presence, which demanded a certain measure of deference from all who passed by. Others in the courtyard, inspired by the guard's stoic dignity, began snapping photos from a respectful distance, whispering among themselves about the storied tales of these guardians who had once stood unwavering even in the face of invading armies. Yet, amidst the swirl of admiration, the tourist's every move seemed to undercut the reverence that saturated the atmosphere, creating an uneasy tension between his larger-than-life ego and the timeless grace that the palace embodied. It didn't help that he occasionally raised his voice to address his assistants, making trivial complaints about the local coffee being too weak or the day's heat being unbearably oppressive, further unsettling the delicate balance that polite society sought to maintain within these hallowed walls. Echoes of hushed disapproval followed him through corridors decorated with centuries-old tapestries, each woven thread telling its own story of courage and resilience. And yet his attention strayed not to these regal achievements, but to the reflections of his own form in the polished marble floors. Every now and then he would pause to quickly adjust his hair or straighten his tie, content in the knowledge that all eyes were upon him, as if the palace had been built for the sole purpose of providing a majestic backdrop against which his presence could be magnified. The grand tour had been designed with painstaking detail, incorporating visits to the iconic throne room, the royal chapel, and the guards' barracks to give visitors a comprehensive understanding of the monarchy's proud legacy. The tourist, however, appeared only superficially interested, using the opportunity to highlight his wealth and status rather than absorb the significance of the kingdom's heritage. Some of the other visitors, trying to cling to the day's intended spirit of appreciation and respect, whispered to one another about the tourist's arrogant demeanour, voicing concerns that perhaps his presence here was a test of the palace's famed patience and decorum. Outside, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, an omen that, to many locals, signalled a shift not just in weather but also in fortune, and a ripple of anxiety circulated among the courtyard's onlookers, whose intuition told them that tension of this magnitude rarely dissipated without incident. A subtle breeze picked up, ruffling the feathers in the elaborate hats of passing nobility and flickering the flames of the tall gilded lanterns that lined the courtyard, further contributing to the feeling that a storm, literal or metaphorical, was brewing. The Royal Guard, trained to remain resolute through any disturbance, maintained their stillness with an unbreakable commitment, though a careful observer might have caught the slightest tightening of a jaw or narrowing of the eyes, indicators that the tourist's brashness had not gone entirely unnoticed. Meanwhile, palace officials, stationed discreetly around the premises, exchanged worried looks, aware that even a minor breach of etiquette could escalate quickly in a place where respect for tradition was paramount and the sanctity of the monarchy was preserved above all else. The wealthy traveller himself seemed wholly unperturbed by the electric undercurrent surrounding him, choosing instead to survey the premises with a leisurely arrogance, as though searching for the next spectacle to amuse him, oblivious to the unspoken warnings in the air. His assistants trailed behind like anxious shadows, each step betraying their growing unease at the chasm widening between their employer's behaviour and the palace's meticulously upheld customs. Perhaps a more empathetic visitor would have softened his demeanour at the sight of local families who came from miles around to witness the royal changing of the guard, kids clinging excitedly to their parents as they gazed upon the spectacle of polished uniforms and synchronized drills. But for this man, any sense of wonder seemed absent, replaced instead by a cavalier disregard for ceremony. As the minutes ticked by, tension coiled tighter, an invisible cord pulling all attention toward the possibility of a confrontation. And though no one could yet predict the exact catalyst, whispers spread speculation that the tourist's brazen attitude might culminate in something truly alarming. Feigning interest in a large portrait of the current monarch, painted in rich oils and framed by intricate scrollwork, the tourist sneered under his breath, making a private remark to one of his assistants that the painting style was outdated, inadvertently speaking loud enough for a passing palace guy to overhear. At this point, any illusions that he might show a modicum of respect during his visit were dispelled, and several visitors quietly drifted away to observe the guard's ceremonial shift, hoping the shift in venue might shield them from whatever unpleasantness might unfold. Nevertheless, the palace atmosphere continued to darken around the edges, like an approaching storm cloud, threatening to unleash a downpour at any moment, a sensation that crawled beneath the skin of guests, staff, and even the unwavering guards themselves. The lingering sense of foreboding was punctuated only by the faint echoes of footsteps on stone and the steady drumbeat of the guards' routine inspection. A cadence that usually brought order but now felt like the countdown to something inevitable. Small clusters of palace officials hovered at a discreet distance, ready to intervene should the tourist's arrogance escalate into outright disrespect, their faces etched with worry as they silently prayed that tradition would hold strong against personal hubris. Yet, for all their vigilance, none could predict the precise moment this tension would snap, setting into motion a series of events that would rock the palace to its core and forever mark the day as one of the strangest in its long and storied existence. Even the birds that typically soared above the courtyard with carefree abandon seemed to have vanished, as though sensing the shifting mood and choosing to avoid the brewing storm, leaving the once lively sky eerily empty. And so, under the heavy gaze of history and the silent watch of the royal guard, the wealthy tourist continued his tour, his stride confident and his eyes fixed on the horizon of his own grandeur, entirely unaware that the palace itself seemed to bristle at his dismissive presence, setting the stage for a moment that would test the kingdom's renowned composure, shatter the tourist's complacency, and echo far beyond these majestic walls in the days and weeks to come. The moment came without warning, erupting in the grand courtyard like a thunderclap, as the wealthy tourist's irritation crescendoed into a reckless act that would shock every witness to the core, forever staining the proud marble floors with the memory of his brazen affront. In the minutes leading up to the incident, he had prowled the grounds with an unmistakable air of entitlement, glancing disparagingly at the ceremonial drills performed by the royal guard, muttering under his breath about the unnecessary pageantry that, in his eyes, wasted precious time he could have spent on more profitable pursuits. The guards, stalwart as statues in their formation, bore the man's scornful sneers without so much as a flinch, clinging to the centuries-old discipline that mandated unwavering composure even in the face of provocation. Yet beneath their stoic facade, a subtle tension began to coil, hinting that the day might not end peacefully. Just as the guard captain gave a curt nod to signal the next phase of the ceremonial handover, a hush rippled through the onlookers, some of whom sensed the growing restlessness of the stranger standing near the front, his expensive shoes tapping impatiently on the polished stones, as though each second spent witnessing this proud tradition was a personal affront to his own significance. Indeed, the guard's choreographed precision, each rifle lifted and lowered in unison, Each pivot timed to the exact beat of the drum seemed only to inflame the tourist's silent contempt. A reaction that reached its boiling point when one of the guards, newly positioned, stepped a fraction too close to where he stood, inadvertently brushing the edge of the tourist's pristine suit jacket with a gloved hand. An audible huff escaped the wealthy man's lips, and though a swift apology from the guard would have placated most, the strict protocol of palace duty forbade any such acknowledgement. The guard remained staring straight ahead, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on a distant point, refusing to break formation or speak. In a matter of heartbeats, the tourist's scowl deepened from mild annoyance to seething anger, for he interpreted the guard's disciplined silence not as adherence to tradition, but as a personal snub, a refusal to offer the deference he believed he deserved. The tension crackled through the air, driving nearby visitors to shuffle nervously in place, some whispering among themselves about this confrontation that felt dangerously close to a spark igniting dry tinder, while others stood transfixed, unable to tear their eyes away from the man whose arrogance now threatened to erupt in full force. No one could have predicted how drastically his frustration would manifest, but the faintest glimmer in his eyes suggested he was ready to lash out at the nearest target. And that target, by unhappy circumstance, just happened to be the guard who had dared step within inches of his immaculate wardrobe. A single second of taut silence passed as the tourist drew himself upright, squared his shoulders, and summoned a contemptuous glare aimed directly at the guard's impassive face, his knuckles whitening as he clenched his fists at his sides. Then, in a flash of unthinkable disrespect, he spat, the motion swift and deliberate, his entire frame twisting to project his rage onto the guard's cheek, leaving a small glistening stain that caught the sunlight in a sickening moment of clarity. The gasp that followed was immediate and universal, a collective intake of breath that seemed to still time itself, as onlookers stared at the guard with wide eyes, half expecting an explosive retaliation for this unimaginable breach of conduct. The guard's face, streaked by the tourist's spit, remained immobile, bound by training that forbade him from moving or expressing emotion in response to provocation. Yet the faint trembling in his jaw hinted at the extraordinary restraint it took not to strike back. Nearby, a mother quickly covered her young daughter's eyes as if to shield her from witnessing such a raw display of contempt, while others, either unsure of the local laws or fearful of inserting themselves into a clash with a man who boasted so much wealth and influence, froze in place, uncertain of what might come next. The guard, stoic as a marble carving, stood unwavering as the bead of spittle slowly slid down his cheek, glinting in the sun, a dreadful testament to the line that had just been crossed, one that no one imagined could occur in such a hallowed space. Palace officials stationed along the perimeter of the courtyard exchanged urgent glances, as though silently communicating who should act first, each fully aware of the gravity of an assault, even one as seemingly minor as spitting, upon the kingdom's most venerated protectors. For a long, drawn-out instant, it seemed as if the entire courtyard might implode under the weight of absolute shock, while the tourist, breathing heavily, appeared to revel in the power of his aggression, wearing a triumphant expression that silently stated, "I am untouchable." Then the stunned silence shattered into a cacophony of alarmed voices. Some cried out in indignation, condemning the man's outrageously disrespectful act, while others scrambled to distance themselves from him, lest they be tarred by association should the guards retaliate or the law descend in full force. Guards from the flanking positions, though constrained by strict discipline, shifted subtly, their eyes snapping to the scene, silently awaiting the next command from their superior officer, who wore a look of grim determination. The tourists' personal assistants, stunned as they might have been by their employer's brazen behaviour, visibly paled and began to plead with him, pulling at his sleeves and urging him to calm down. But he shook them off with an imperious gesture, as if to say that he alone would decide the outcome of this confrontation. A palace herald, having witnessed the atrocity, blew a sharp note on a silver horn to signal a breach of protocol, a call that resounded across the courtyard and signalled all relevant authorities that immediate action was required to contain the unfolding crisis. The crowd, now thrumming with equal parts outrage and fascination, surged closer in a messy ring, inadvertently forming a makeshift arena around the tourist and the guard, as if drawn by some primal curiosity to see how far the tourist would push his luck and whether the guard would continue to uphold the stoic tradition he had sworn to maintain. Meanwhile, the guard still refused to wipe his cheek, adhering strictly to regulations that permitted no sudden movement during official ceremonies. But the rigid set of his jaw spoke volumes of the internal struggle that waged within him. A soldier's devotion to duty pitted against a human's raw instinct to defend his dignity. Tension mounted with every passing heartbeat, the air so thick with anticipation that it was nearly suffocating, and the tourist's chest rose and fell with palpable aggression, as though he were a predator asserting dominance over an unwilling adversary. Murmurs of disbelief spread among visitors from foreign lands, who had never seen the Royal Guard treated with anything less than the highest respect, leading them to wonder if this infraction might trigger dire consequences for the man responsible. One by one, mobile phones emerged from pockets and bags, capturing footage of an event that, only minutes ago, would have seemed unimaginable in this sacred seat of tradition. The swirl of lenses and the flicker of record lights cast an eerie glow of modern voyeurism over a scene that was already laced with historical significance. Every official and dignitary who caught wind of the incident displayed horror at the notion that the monarchy's revered protectors could be so openly disrespected. But an even deeper dread began to percolate in the background. The question of how the monarchy would respond to an insult that ran so profoundly counter to centuries of honour and decorum. The tourist himself, emboldened by what he perceived as a lack of immediate retaliation, seemed to smirk as if spitting on the guard's face was only the beginning of what he believed he could get away with, thanks to his wealth and the power it so often conferred. Yet behind that smug facade, a flicker of uncertainty glimmered in his eyes. For this was not a simple bar altercation in a place that could be bought out with a well-placed bribe. This was the heart of a kingdom that prided itself on timeless values, and he had just trampled over one of its most sacred principles. In the distance, a deep roll of thunder echoed from the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, a natural omen that seemed to mirror the emotional tempest unleashed within the palace walls. And the crowd shuddered collectively as raindrops began to patter onto the courtyard's marble tiles, each drop adding a note of gravity to the spectacle. The guard superior, a figure of imposing stature and decorated uniform, stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the stone, and though his expression remained measured, the stern set of his mouth said everything. Formal action was about to be taken. Palace staff members, normally invisible as they smoothly guided tours and answered questions, now hurried to clear a path, hoping to avert a stampede of curious bystanders if the incident escalated further, an outcome that seemed almost inevitable given the tourists' unyielding stance. Onlookers craned their necks to catch every detail, some murmuring fervent prayers for peace, others quietly salivating over the drama, as high stakes as any they had witnessed within the venerable walls of the palace grounds. Despite the guard's impeccable training and vow to remain rigid until relieved, a tear glistened in the corner of his eye. Though whether it was from the sting of humiliation or the emotional weight of betraying his own natural impulses, no one could truly say. What was clear, however, was that the dignity of the monarchy was at stake, and the guard's role in preserving it had never been more crucial. Feeling the prickle of countless stares upon him, the tourist took a step backward, as though daring the assembled guards to break protocol by pursuing him, but they remained statuesque, pinned in place by duty, waiting for the official order to move. Even so, the taste of tension in the air was unmistakable, and the tourist's assistants, now frantic, attempted once again to guide him away, pleading under their breath that his money might not protect him from the consequences of such a blatant transgression against the kingdom's core traditions. Yet the man, still clinging to his delusional sense of invulnerability, shrugged them off, planting himself firmly before the guard whose face he had so callously defiled, clearly unafraid of the consequences that he believed his wealth and status would nullify. All around him, the courtyard buzzed with speculation about the guard's next move. Would he break formation and retaliate, violating the monarchy's proud code of stoicism? Or would he stand silently, reliant on the palace's legal authority to seek justice on his behalf? The thunder rumbled again, closer this time, as though nature itself were heralding the ominous confrontation. And the guard captain glanced up momentarily at the darkening sky, a silent testament that the kingdom's peace was likewise overshadowed by gathering storm clouds of its own. Children clutched their parents' hands, frightened not just by the aggression, but by the realization that an unthinkable line had been crossed, and the repercussions of this act would reverberate far beyond the day's ceremonial routine. In that pregnant pause, wherein everyone's hearts thumped collectively in anticipation, the guard, still resolute, allowed only the slightest tremor to pass over his brow, betraying the turmoil within as he waited for his commanding officer to grant him permission to move, for no soldier of the Royal Guard would compromise centuries of discipline for a momentary lapse of rage. Then, like a cord snapping under unbearable tension, the officer's command rang out in a firm, resonant tone, and the guard straightened with renewed purpose, ready to enact whatever course of duty the monarchy's protocol prescribed for dealing with an assault on the kingdom's symbolic protectors. The tourist stood defiant, though a shadow of doubt momentarily crossed his features, a fleeting recognition that he might have awakened forces far greater than he anticipated. And as the first droplets of cold rain intensified, mixing with the echo of outraged voices, the scene was set for a consequence that would mark the palace's halls with an indelible stain of scandal. And in that single suspended instant between the guard's stoic endurance and the palace's inevitable response, all those present understood in their bones that a line had been crossed that could never be undone, shaping the fate not only of the arrogant tourist, but of all who had witnessed a moment so startling, so unimaginably brazen, that it would echo through the annals of the kingdom's history for generations to come. The guard captain's authoritative voice cut through the thickening tension like a razor's edge, summoning a cadre of uniformed palace officials who swiftly encircled the arrogant tourist, their disciplined footsteps clicking across the gleaming marble in perfect synchronicity, reflecting the gravity of the moment that was about to unfold. Despite the immediate sense of alarm cast by the presence of so many officials, the tourist stood firm, chin raised defiantly, attempting to project an air of unassailable confidence, even as he felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. The stain of spittle still glistened on the guard's cheek, a silent and damning reminder of the unparalleled disrespect that had sparked this crisis, while the guard himself remained stoic, his shoulders rigid with the internal battle between duty and sheer indignation. In hushed tones, the palace officials communicated among themselves, acknowledging how rare such a brazen act was within these hallowed walls, and how imperative it had become to maintain the monarchy's dignity in the face of this affront. Tourists and citizens alike pressed in closer, forming a cautious circle around the unfolding confrontation, some lifting cameras to document every second as though uncertain their words alone could convey the shocking spectacle later. A faint ripple of thunder accompanied the hiss of the growing rain, punctuating the grim tableau with Mother Nature's own dramatic flair, underscoring the sense that a monumental reckoning was at hand. The highest-ranking official present, a stern-faced man wearing a meticulously tailored uniform embellished with the palace's crest, stepped forward and locked eyes with the belligerent visitor, issuing a measured but firm command that he stand down. Unwilling to relinquish the sense of superiority he believed his vast fortune conferred upon him. The tourist instead crossed his arms over his chest, mustering a cavalier smirk that he hoped would mask the flicker of anxiety dancing beneath his exterior composure. At that moment, the guard captain nodded to his subordinates, a silent directive that prompted two officials to move closer and block the tourist's path, preventing him from either escaping or charging forward in another fit of impudence. Realizing that he was at least partially cornered, the tourist erupted in a stream of protest, his clipped, condescending tone laced with entitlement as he demanded to speak to someone in charge, evidently believing that someone with proper authority would dismiss the entire incident upon learning of his vast resources. The guard who had been insulted remained as still as the statues lining the palace courtyard, his training as a royal guard holding him rigid, despite the burning humiliation he must have felt, while a single rivulet of water trickled from the tip of his polished helmet, mingling with the tourist's spittle on his cheek. The onlookers began to murmur in sympathy and anger, many outraged by the brazen act they had witnessed, and a handful called out for swift punishment, insisting that no amount of wealth should excuse such a heinous slight against the crown's protectors. Sensing that the situation threatened to spiral out of control, an older official stepped between the tourist and the guard, gently ushering the guard a few paces back in a subtle effort to relieve him from the confrontation's epicenter, while the tourist glowered at this maneuver as though it deprived him of a target for his anger. Outside the immediate commotion, more guards filed in, adopting a strategic formation that not only safeguarded the palace's vital corridors, but also contained the disturbance in a single area, thereby limiting the risk of panic spreading through the droves of unsuspecting visitors. A crack of lightning illuminated the leaden sky as if reflecting the turmoil below, and the tourist's assistants, thoroughly panicked, tried one last time to intercede on his behalf, pleading in hushed voices that he relent and apologize before the monarchy's justice might be imposed. Brushing them aside, he insisted that his prestige far exceeded that of any local official, and that a few phone calls would swiftly resolve what he deemed a trivial misunderstanding, prompting gasps from those who recognized the kingdom's centuries-old intolerance for any assault, physical or otherwise, on the royal guard. The officials in command listened with stony expressions, aware that it was not their place to negotiate or bargain in matters of respect for the monarchy's symbols. They had long ago pledged to uphold the law of the land, and that law recognized no exceptions for wealth or fame. One official produced a small leather-bound citation book from within his coat, a grim relic used only. In the most serious breaches of palace protocol, setting every observer's nerves on edge and sending a renewed wave of whispers through the crowd. Firmly gripping the citation book, he recited the relevant statute that defined spitting on a royal guard as an act of criminal disrespect, an offence punishable by means that ranged from hefty fines to harsher consequences, depending on the degree and circumstances of the insult. The tourist's eyes widened momentarily at the recitation, though he quickly arranged his features back into a mask of haughty indifference, once more insisting that his identity and influence would shield him from any real penalty. The guard captain, mindful that the monarchy's reputation hinged on how this crisis was handled, gestured toward the spattered guard, whose stoicism had never wavered, and calmly requested that he report to a private chamber for debriefing, as was custom following any personal affront, thereby dismissing him from his posted duty with honor. This motion drew a muted round of respectful nods from the palace staff and some bystanders, for it recognized the guard's dignity while preserving the ceremonial conduct that had been so viciously violated. Meanwhile, the tourist spat another verbal barrage at the officials, dismissing them as petty functionaries, which only served to further galvanize their determination to follow every protocol required by palace law. As the drizzle intensified, officials signaled the retreat of the ceremonial guard procession, their stoic ranks peeling away into the palace's interior corridors to avoid the risk of further disruption and to ensure the incident remained contained. For the tourist, however, any notion of quietly exiting the scene had vanished. He stood like a lightning rod in the center of the gathering storm, continuing to sneer at the officers even as droplets of rain darkened his suit jacket and plastered stray hairs against his brow. Keenly observing every detail, the palace's lead official measured the tourist's arrogance with a calculating gaze, deciding that mere citation would not suffice for an offence so deliberately public and unapologetic. A messenger was dispatched to fetch a higher authority, someone vested with the power to render a more decisive verdict on the matter, while the murmuring crowd gradually recognized that this was not a trivial clash, but rather a seminal test of how far the monarchy would go to defend the sanctity of its traditions. Although the tourist's voice rose in intermittent outbursts, claiming he would own this place before he allowed anyone to punish him, there was an underlying tremor in his words, like the slightest crack in a once impenetrable facade of self-importance. The presence of so many cameras, the unyielding lines of guards, and the knowledge that centuries of law would stand against him seemed to unnerve him more than he cared to admit, even as he doubled down on his air of superiority. Behind the scenes, palace staff moved with swift precision, directing frightened visitors away from the scene and ensuring that vantage points from certain corridors were discreetly blocked, a method designed to prevent panic and preserve the monarchy's image from further scandal. Occasionally, a flash of lightning would illuminate the windows high above the courtyard, casting long, ominous shadows across the group of officials and the lone figure who dared challenge them, as if the very architecture bore witness to the day's tumult. Rain-soaked and surrounded, the tourist's manic energy began to shift from raw indignation to a more simmering desperation, though he strove to cloak it behind repeated declarations of, "I'll have your jobs, and my lawyers will tear this kingdom's codes apart." No official deigned to reply to these threats, for each knew that the monarchy's legal foundation, steeped in centuries of unbroken lineage, would not be lightly undone by the bluster of a foreign national. Resentment bristled among the gathered staff, officials, and onlookers alike, for the tourist's unrepentant stance insulted not just a single guard, but the entire legacy of a kingdom founded on reverence for its protectors. Thunder rumbled again, and a cluster of robed legal advisors, summoned by the messenger, emerged from the palace's ornate archways, their solemn faces reflecting both the solemn duty ahead and the late hour into which these proceedings might stretch. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, for the next moments would determine whether the tourist would submit, no matter how unwillingly, to the kingdom's justice, or whether he would attempt something even more audacious to escape culpability. The highest-ranking official approached with careful, deliberate steps, instructing the tourist that he must either comply with palace protocol, submitting to questioning and possible arrest, or face immediate and forceful detainment, emphasizing that his wealth did not exempt him from accountability. At this declaration, the crowd's whispers crescendoed, a mixture of relief, curiosity, and lingering dread, for all understood the significance of challenging a foreign magnate in so public a manner, even if justice demanded it. A twitch of uncertainty passed across the tourist's features, yet he continued to defy them, barking orders to his assistants to call my embassy and inform my private security team, inadvertently admitting that he feared he might not be able to talk his way out of the predicament alone. The palace officials' expressions remained impassive, reflecting a collective resolve to see this matter through by the book, for letting him walk away now would undermine not only the guard's honour, but the very foundation of trust that upheld the monarchy's rule. In the looming silence that followed, punctuated only by the pelting rain and the occasional crack of lightning, the tourist at last realised that no one was going to yield. Wealth, Status and threats meant nothing in a place where centuries of law dictated that the guards must be upheld as living symbols of the crown's virtue. Stripped of his usual power to intimidate or negotiate his way out, he launched into a stream of empty bluster, claiming that the palace would rue the day it crossed him. Yet the officials stood firm, countering each syllable with the unspoken truth that such an offence could not be ignored. One of the robed legal advisers stepped forward, lifted his voice above the rumbling skies, and formally declared that an inquiry had begun into the alleged assault on the royal guard, which would proceed under the direct authority of the palace's highest legal tribunal if necessary, prompting hushed gasps from the assembled crowd. Though he tried to cling to his bravado, the tourist could not hide the faint tremor in his voice as he insisted this entire process was an overreaction. But the resolute faces of the palace officials made it clear that the monarchy viewed spitting on a guard as an affront to every subject who respected the crown. On the periphery of the courtyard, some of the more tender-hearted onlookers stared at the drenched figure in pity, wondering how a life defined by opulence could produce such tragic short-sightedness, while others simply seethed with anger at the callous disregard for centuries-old customs. Lightning flickered yet again, illuminating the fine raindrops in mid-air, and with a final clap of thunder, the stage was fully set for the official confrontation. A legal and moral struggle that would echo throughout the palace's hallowed halls long after the tempest subsided. That night, though the spires and turrets of the palace had weathered countless storms over the centuries, many whispered that the tension in the air was unlike any they had felt before, as if the monarchy itself had been challenged to prove its unwavering commitment to the ideals it championed. One by one, the officials turned toward the interior corridors, silently instructing the tourist to follow, indicating that any further defiance would result in immediate restraint, a reality that finally began to chip away at his previously unshakable demeanour. Biting back a retort, he took a hesitant step forward, accompanied by a contingent of stern-faced guards, the spectacle unfolding like the opening scene of a grand courtroom drama, with every player poised to assume their role in a story that would not soon be forgotten. And so, beneath the relentless rain, and amid the whispers of a crowd whose shock would not soon fade, the tourist was escorted away. His wealth and arrogance rendered powerless by the unyielding traditions of a kingdom that would not allow even the smallest insult to its guards' honour to go unanswered. The storm raged through the night, drumming steadily against the palace's high-arched windows, as the arrogant tourist found himself confined within an ornate but ominously guarded chamber that starkly contrasted the luxury he was accustomed to, signalling the imminent clash between his personal worldview and the kingdom's ancient customs. In this forced solitude, he paced restlessly across the polished mosaic floor, surrounded by walls lined with centuries-old tapestries depicting heroic monarchs and legendary battles. A testament to a realm that valued history and honor above personal wealth. Though draped in finery, the room felt more like a gilded prison than a guest suite, as uniformed guards, ever watchful, maintained a vigilant post outside the heavy carved doors, their resolute silence unnerving him more with each passing hour. Sleep proved elusive, for every time he closed his eyes, the indignation of the crowd flashed behind his eyelids, reminding him that he had become an object of collective scorn in a kingdom where disrespecting a royal guard was akin to spitting on the monarchy itself. At the first light of dawn, an officious palace steward arrived with a summons, announcing in clipped tones that the tourist's presence was required in the Hall of Judgments, a chamber reserved for official inquiries and the ceremonial arbitration of royal law. The steward's tone left no doubt that this was an extraordinary measure, not typically extended to outsiders. Head pounding from a restless night, the tourist followed the steward reluctantly, flanked on either side by guards whose unwavering expressions revealed no sympathy, only a rigid adherence to protocol that underscored how differently this society functioned compared to what he knew. The corridor leading to the Hall of Judgments was a masterpiece of architectural grandeur. Vaulted ceilings, intricately carved wooden panels, and stained glass windows casting coloured shards of light onto the marble floor. But none of its beauty could ease the knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach as he approached the towering double doors. A hush seemed to descend upon the palace as the doors swung open, revealing a cavernous chamber adorned with portraits of past monarchs in gilded frames, their stern gazes seemingly evaluating the tourist's worth and finding it lacking. At the far end of the hall, seated behind a massive, ornately carved desk, was a high-ranking official known as the Chancellor of Traditions, renowned not only for his extensive knowledge of the kingdom's legal codes, but also for his resolute belief in preserving age-old customs. Gathered along the chamber's periphery were various courtiers and legal advisers, their robes of office brushing against polished tiles. And at their centre stood the guard captain, whose posture exuded unwavering confidence in the justice he believed was about to be served. As the tourist stepped forward, bristling at what he perceived to be a theatrical display meant solely to intimidate, he noticed a slight stirring among the assembled officials, a ripple of whispers that quieted the moment the Chancellor cleared his throat. One seat remained conspicuously vacant near the Chancellor's table, its high back upholstered in regal velvet, and it took only a moment for the tourist to realize this seat was reserved for a royal figure of exceptional rank, someone whose presence could mean the difference between leniency and severe punishment. The Chancellor's voice, measured and resonant, welcomed the tourist formally, yet offered no warmth, immediately launching into a speech that underscored the kingdom's centuries-long tradition of unwavering respect toward the royal guard, a venerated institution that served as the monarchy's shield and moral compass. With unwavering conviction, the Chancellor explained that, in the kingdom's eyes, spitting upon a member of the royal guard was not merely an insult to an individual, but a desecration of the monarchy's symbolic honour, something that not even the highest circles of aristocracy could ignore. The tourist, struggling to retain his composure, attempted to interject with claims of misunderstanding and undue severity, but the Chancellor coolly informed him that this realm's statutes were explicit. An assault of this nature demanded formal proceedings to determine the depth of contrition and the appropriate course of atonement. It became unmistakably clear that no amount of wealth or influence could sway the kingdom's legal traditions, for the monarchy's foundation rested on its unwavering commitment to maintaining respect for the guardians who had defended it for generations. At that moment, the heavy chamber doors opened again, and a hush fell across the hall as a figure draped in regal attire entered, an esteemed member of the royal family, whose presence rarely graced such hearings except under the gravest circumstances. All eyes turned to this dignitary, a person of quiet composure and measured elegance, whose mere appearance signalled the seriousness with which the monarchy regarded the offence at hand. The tourist felt his pulse quicken, realising that if he had believed he could negotiate his way out of trouble, this development shattered any remaining illusions. The monarchy had rallied its highest ranks to address the slight he had committed. Settling into the vacant seat, the royal figure cast a sweeping gaze across the room, pausing on the tourist, with an expression that carried neither overt fury nor leniency, only a serene sort of gravity befitting one who must judge wrongdoing in the light of centuries-old tradition. The Chancellor resumed speaking, outlining the details of the offence in formal terms. The blatant act of spitting, the public humiliation of the guard, and the tourist's subsequent lack of remorse, all of which increased the severity of the transgression in the kingdom's assessment. To underscore the weight of the situation, courtiers offered testimonies from bystanders who had witnessed the scene in the courtyard, providing details that painted the tourist as an aggressor driven by entitlement rather than a victim of misunderstanding. Next, a young adjutant stepped forward, recounting the guard's personal statement in which he described the humiliation, yet also expressed unwavering commitment to abiding by the monarchy's code of conduct, even in the face of personal affront. Hearing this, the tourist felt a pang he would never admit. A mixture of shame and incredulity that such devotion to duty could exist in a world he had long considered corruptible by money and prestige. Eager to defend himself, he launched into a rebuttal, claiming that the guard had provoked him by infringing upon his personal space and that his action had been impulsive, not malicious. But the court officials remained unconvinced. Their society's ethos required them to prioritize the guard's dignity and the monarchy's honor above all else, rendering excuses that might hold sway in other places effectively moot. Patiently, the Chancellor explained that, regardless of motive, spitting was seen as a deliberate and symbolic desecration, something even more grievous than striking a guard, for it attacked the guard's personhood and, by extension, the monarchy's collective pride. As the tourist's attempts at justification faltered under the unwavering scrutiny of these unyielding traditions, tension swelled in the chamber, highlighted by the occasional flash of lightning visible through tall, arched windows along the hall's upper level. Sensing that facts alone could not penetrate the tourist's armor of arrogance, the royal figure spoke for the first time, softly but with unmistakable authority, pointing out that the kingdom's heritage demanded respect for those who safeguarded its peace, and that this principle was non-negotiable. To demonstrate the monarchy's willingness to offer a path to redemption, should genuine remorse be present, the royal figure invited the tourist to publicly acknowledge his wrongdoing and pledge an act of contrition, a symbolic gesture the kingdom prized as a demonstration of humility. The tourist, torn between his ingrained hubris and a growing realization of the trouble he faced, hesitated, his gaze flickering uncertainly around the silent chamber, searching in vain for an exit strategy that might spare him the embarrassment of submission. He found only still resolute faces, a tapestry of culture and tradition woven together over countless generations, each thread stronger than his wealth and more enduring than his name. Even so, a persistent spark of defiance flared in his chest, fueling a last-ditch attempt to plead diplomatic immunity through his nation's embassy. But the Chancellor reminded him that this was an internal palace matter, subject to laws that were older than modern treaties. The tourist felt a surge of indignation flooding back, battling with the flicker of fear in his stomach, as he realized he had entered a realm where titles like billionaire carried little weight, and the only currency that mattered was respect or its painful absence. Meanwhile, the spectators lining the edges of the hall traded murmurs in hushed tones, remarking how rarely they had seen a foreigner so thoroughly ensnared by the monarchy's unyielding protocols, and they speculated on whether he would bend or be broken by the day's end. Pressured to articulate his stance, the tourist stumbled through a disjointed speech that attempted to downplay the significance of spitting, referring to it as a minor slip in an otherwise chaotic moment. A statement that elicited a sharp intake of breath from several onlookers, who recognized it as an ill-chosen defense. The Chancellor swiftly reminded him that what might be trivial in certain parts of the world was, within these walls, a grave insult spanning centuries of custom, and that the onus lay on him to adapt to the kingdom's standards during his stay, not the other way round. Desperate now, the tourist glanced towards the royal figure, whose inscrutable expression offered neither rescue nor condemnation, merely a silent expectation that contrition must come from within if it were to mean anything at all. The guard captain's voice, suddenly breaking through the tension, underscored the guard's perspective. Countless generations had sacrificed for the monarchy, some even with their lives, and to degrade a guard publicly was to show contempt for that proud lineage. In that moment, something wavered in the tourist's composure, a realization that he stood alone against an unbreakable wall of tradition, and that continuing to brandish his ego as a shield only deepened the chasm between him and the society before him. Still, he could not bring himself to kneel or confess regret, for doing so would mean acknowledging that this kingdom's values outweighed his own, a notion he had rarely encountered in his insular world of privilege. Sensing the standoff's impasse, the Chancellor announced that formal deliberations would commence immediately, with a select council of adjudicators reviewing every detail to determine the appropriate consequence under the monarchy's centuries-tested legal framework. As courtiers and officials formed into orderly lines, preparing to file out of the chamber and commence the behind-closed-doors discussions, the royal figure rose gracefully, offering the tourist a final level gaze that spoke volumes. The door to atonement was still open, but not indefinitely. The tourist remained rooted in place, feeling both cornered and strangely compelled to reflect upon the clash of values that had led him here, where centuries of unwavering tradition now threatened to overshadow his carefully cultivated aura of untouchable wealth. At a gentle but firm prompt from a guard, he finally turned to follow the assembled party toward an antechamber, where he would await the council's judgment, every step echoing like a death knell of his old certainty. There, surrounded by murmuring courtiers and the unwavering glare of centuries-old portraits, he began to sense the true scope of his offence. For in this land, insulting the royal guard was no minor incident. It was a challenge that might reshape his entire perception of what constituted power and privilege. Even the stark differences in decor, heavy tapestries, ancient suits of armour, and hallowed swords displayed in shimmering cases, seemed to reinforce the idea that he, with all his wealth, was a mere visitor in a realm that cherished intangible legacies above material fortune. In silent defiance, he resolved not to yield lightly, yet a tremor ran through his hands as he recalled the guard's resolute gaze, the unwavering hush of the crowd, and the unimaginable gravity of centuries pressing down upon him. A single thought emerged with startling clarity as he stood before an ornate wooden door that led to the waiting area for the accused. He was no longer the wealthiest person in the room, nor the most powerful, nor even the most respected. And for the first time in his life, that stark reality truly frightened him. Inside the antechamber, the wealthy tourist sat on a stiff-backed chair, the hush of the palace's ancient corridors pressing in on him as he awaited the council's judgment, each passing moment magnifying the weight of his transgression. All around him, the subdued hum of hushed conversation carried the same question. Could a man so accustomed to privilege ever grasp the depth of the harm he had inflicted by spitting on the royal guard's face? The stone walls of the waiting hall, adorned with faded tapestries depicting centuries of battle and triumph, seemed to echo the solemnity of what was at stake, reminding him that he now stood accountable not just to a single individual, but to the kingdom's entire lineage of honour. His assistants hovered nearby, whispering frantic reassurances that legal counsel would surely arrive soon, that money could smooth out any complication, and yet their words felt hollow in a realm where tradition dwarfed the power of wealth. A heaviness settled over him as he recalled the guard's unwavering posture, the unwavering gaze of a man whose pride had been stained, yet who refused to let wrath dictate his next move, a reminder of how starkly their values diverged. Despite his usual bravado, the tourist found himself grappling with questions he had never before considered. Questions of responsibility, morality, and respect, each one chipping away at the wall of entitlement he had carefully constructed over the years. Outside, the storm had eased to a gentle drizzle, but within the palace, the tension remained a storm unto itself, swirling around him with no promise of a swift resolution, only the certainty of judgment. At one point, a junior official approached, carrying a worn leather ledger and ink quill, silently taking down any pertinent details before vanishing again into the maze of corridors, leaving the tourist to wonder whether his every word and gesture was being recorded for posterity. Stripped of his usual comforts and the protective shield of wealth, he became acutely aware of how small he felt in a place that had stood for centuries, guarded by men willing to devote their entire lives to upholding a code of honour far older and more unyielding than his self-assured conceit. In the adjacent corridor, the guard who had been spat upon was likewise ushered into a quiet room by a soft-spoken advisor, who offered him a towel to dry the rain from his uniform and inquired after his well-being, ever mindful of the mental toll the insult might have taken. Though outwardly stoic, the guard wrestled with a private turmoil. He knew his duty demanded composure, yet beneath his unflinching exterior, a raw sense of violation lingered, a wound inflicted not just on his person, but on the very dignity of the uniform he wore. He could still feel the ghostly trace of the tourist's spit on his cheek, a memory that clung to him like an indelible mark, reminding him how fragile the boundary was between disciplined control and the primal urge to defend his own honour. Nevertheless, he resolved to abide by his training, placing his trust in the palace's legal mechanisms, understanding that any act of personal vengeance would only sully the proud tradition he had pledged to uphold. Meanwhile, in the antechamber, the tourist shifted uneasily in his seat, acutely aware of the fact that the guard's unspoken testimony, his silent endurance in the face of blatant disrespect, spoke volumes about the moral chasm separating them. A creeping sense of shame warred with his persistent defensiveness, for part of him still believed that, in the world he usually inhabited, the solution to most problems lay in financial restitution or a carefully managed public relations statement. Yet here, among these centuries-old walls and unwavering customs, such a tactic felt impotent, rendered trivial by the gravity of a culture that placed character above the capital. Hour by hour, the tourist found himself replaying the moment of his spitting, a visceral act so deeply out of step with the reverence that permeated this kingdom until the memory itself became almost too painful to bear. From time to time, messengers in modest livery passed through with quiet efficiency, delivering sealed envelopes or murmuring updates to the official who maintained watch in the hall, but never sparing so much as a sympathetic glance toward the tourist's predicament. Each swift exchange underscored how impersonal the proceedings were turning out to be. This was not a spectacle for cheap entertainment, but a sober reckoning governed by institutions whose roots stretched back through eras of kings and conquests. The tourist world of private jets, exclusive galas and transactional friendships seemed distant now, overshadowed by a system in which spitting on a single guard was an offence that could summon the full weight of monarchical authority. Eventually, a palace councillor emerged, beckoning him to a smaller chamber draped in thick velvet curtains, where he was instructed to speak candidly about his perspective on the incident, a final chance to make his case before the council began its formal deliberations. Convinced he must protect himself from any admission of guilt, the tourist initially launched into excuses. He had been jet-lagged. He'd felt threatened. He misunderstood the guard's movement, all of which the councillor politely noted, never once refuting or endorsing the claims. Somehow the tourist's own voice felt hollow to his ears, like a distant echo, and the more he tried to paint himself as the aggrieved party, the more he sensed the inadequacy of his justifications, for nothing truly erased the finality of that spit landing on the guard's cheek. With each word, the moral reckoning tightened its grip, forcing him to confront the possibility that he had committed an act which could not be undone by a simple apology or a hefty monetary settlement. Drained and unsteady, he finally fell silent, unsure whether to reiterate his contrition or maintain his defiance. And it was then that the councillor posed a question that cut him to the core. Why did you believe your personal discomfort justified desecrating a symbol of our nation's identity? The tourist stammered, unable to produce a convincing answer beyond the standard self-centered arguments he'd always used. Arguments that rang absurdly shallow in a place where centuries of respect were embedded in everyday life. In that moment, he glanced at his hands, noticing how they trembled, not from anger, but from an unsettling awareness that for all his money and power, he was trapped by his own inability to understand the values he had trampled upon. As word of the impending verdict spread through the palace, the guard himself was asked for a private statement in the same room where the tourists had just been questioned. And though protocol demanded he stick to the facts, he found himself wrestling with feelings of pity for a man who seemed so tragically disconnected from humility. Duty bound him, however, and he reaffirmed the facts. He had been spat upon without provocation, yet he had not retaliated, upholding the standard of conduct his superiors had drilled into him from the day he joined the ranks. When he finished speaking, the counsellor thanked him for his honesty and inquired if the guard wished to see the tourist face severe punishment. But the guard simply replied that his wish was for justice, nothing more or less, revealing a flicker of compassion beneath his disciplined exterior. This nuanced display of measured principle resonated through the halls, quietly compelling even the staunchest palace officials to recognise that while punishment might be necessary, the guard himself harboured no lust for vengeance. Meanwhile, the tourist remained in his gilded waiting chamber, grappling with a new tension that refused to subside, a mixture of genuine remorse and stubborn pride, each vying for dominance in his psyche. At times, he felt an almost feverish desire to confess his wrongdoing and beg for leniency. But his ingrained arrogance cautioned him that to do so would be tantamount to admitting his wealth held no sway here. Whispers travelled quickly through the corridors, suggesting that the monarchy might demand not just a formal apology, but also a highly visible act of contrition, a symbolic gesture to restore the guard's honour and reaffirm the kingdom's principles. In past generations, such gestures could include kneeling before the guard in a public ceremony or sponsoring a charitable cause dear to the monarchy, all of which set the tourist's teeth on edge, for he could not fathom humbling himself so dramatically. Yet the notion of continuing to resist threatened to invite a harsher legal sentence, one that might result in a formal banishment or even confinement in a palace cell. Punishment that could shatter his carefully cultivated image worldwide. Torn between preserving his fragile ego and averting calamity, he found himself experiencing a rare moment of introspection, questioning the very foundation of his attitudes and the legitimacy of a worldview that led him to degrade another human being purely out of convenience. In the hush that followed, the guard, too, found himself in his own corner of the palace, wrestling with a more personal dilemma. Part of him longed for the tourist to display genuine remorse, for that would affirm the moral grounding he had always believed set his kingdom apart. Another part, however, recognised that no apology, however grand, could fully erase the memory of a foreigner's spit sliding down his face in front of scores of onlookers, a stain that had momentarily tarnished not just his uniform, but the collective dignity of the royal guard. As the palace cogs turned relentlessly, preparing for the final judgment, both men, oppressor and victim, were forced to confront a reflection of themselves they had never before encountered. One found a mirror showing him the hollowness behind his riches, while the other grappled with whether his stoic duty could accommodate forgiveness without compromising honour. Daylight began to wane, casting long shadows across the marbled floors, and a herald announced that the council would soon reveal its verdict, prompting an anxious silence as staff and spectators alike gathered in the corridor outside the Great Hall. The tourist, sitting alone, thought of his distant homeland, where he could have easily bought his way out of lesser offences, and he realised with a jolt of dismay that such tactics would only further enrage these officials who valued respect above all else. In a candid moment of clarity, he acknowledged that his life of unchecked privilege had blinded him to the reality that some institutions could not be swayed by a generous check or well-placed bribe, and that perhaps he needed to accept a reckoning he had long avoided. The guard, too, felt a subtle shift in his perspective, reconciling his unwavering loyalty to the monarchy with the understanding that justice in this realm could include both correction and mercy, if guided by a sincere admission of guilt. At last, a court messenger quietly approached the tourist's temporary quarters, informing him that the council's decision was imminent and inviting him to return to the Hall of Judgments, a summons that caused his heart to pound against his ribcage. Rising to his feet, he steadied himself, smoothing the wrinkles from his suit jacket, acknowledging that while he had arrived in this kingdom as an untouchable magnate, he now stood on the threshold of a moral and legal crucible that might redefine him in ways he never imagined. With leaden steps, he followed the messenger down the echoing corridor, passing by tapestries woven with the tales of ancient kings and queens who had faced their own reckonings with a dignity he could only hope to grasp. Each footstep rang in his ears, a countdown to the moment when centuries of tradition would pronounce judgment on a single unthinkable act that had laid bare the emptiness of his privileged worldview. And though he dreaded what lay ahead, some buried piece of his conscience stirred with the faintest glimmer of hope that perhaps, in facing the monarchy's unyielding standards, he might finally find a measure of redemption. The vast Hall of Judgments was lit by the flicker of torchlight dancing across the centuries-old tapestries as the tourist re-entered, heart pounding with each resonant step across the marble floor, aware that his fate and the kingdom's reputation now hung in a delicate balance. In the front of the hall, a high dais had been positioned to face the large wooden doors, and on it sat the royal figure who had previously observed the proceedings, flanked on both sides by solemn-faced council members, each wearing an expression that revealed neither mercy nor condemnation, only patient resolve to uphold the monarchy's tradition of impartial justice. The guard captain stood at a respectful distance, his presence a quiet reminder of the day's offence, while the guard who had been spat upon remained in an antechamber, awaiting the final decision in a gesture of deference that underscored his willingness to abide by the monarchy's protocols. No rustle of conversation broke the hush as the tourist made his way toward a designated spot in the centre of the hall, a lonely stretch of polished stone where accused parties had stood countless times throughout the palace's storied history. The doors thudded shut behind him, and though they did not lock, the sound was definitive, sealing off any illusion of retreat. He was trapped in a crucible of ancient law. One of the council members rose to speak, her voice echoing clearly in the hushed space, recapitulating the details of the offence. An egregious insult levied against a royal guard, the subsequent refusal to offer immediate contrition, and the tourist's repeated attempts to leverage his wealth or status in a futile bid to deflect accountability. The tourist swallowed hard as she emphasized the severity of spitting, how it was considered by their culture to be a degradation not only of a single guard's dignity, but of the entire foundation of the kingdom's moral ethos, dating back to an age where such an act was tantamount to challenging the sovereignty of the ruling crown. When the council member finished, a murmur rippled through the hall, a soft reminder that each person present had followed these events with a blend of disbelief, concern, and indignation ever since that fateful day in the courtyard. The royal figure then leaned forward, commanding absolute silence, and addressed the tourist with a measured tone, neither cold nor warm, explaining that the monarchy's tradition did indeed allow for both justice and grace, but only if the offender demonstrated sincere remorse and agreed to perform a restorative act that honoured the guard's sacrifice. From across the hall, the guard captain maintained a steady gaze, reflecting the tension that underpinned this verdict. For if the tourist refused what the monarchy deemed an acceptable path of atonement, harsher consequences, potentially imprisonment or expulsion, would almost certainly follow. The tourist's pulse thudded in his ears, yet with each carefully chosen word spoken by the royal figure, he felt the magnitude of the kingdom's expectations pressing on him, silently demanding acknowledgement of the moral weight he had tried so long to shrug off. At this moment, the royal figure raised a parchment scroll, its edges embossed with the kingdom's seal, and read out the formal terms of recompense. The tourist must publicly apologize to the guard in a dedicated ceremony, kneel as a sign of respect before the entire assembly, and fund a substantial endowment for the families of active and retired royal guards, a gesture meant to illustrate that he understood the depth of the service they provided. Upon hearing this, the tourist's pride flared reflexively, stirring an internal protest that kneeling was beneath someone of his stature. But as he glanced around at the unyielding faces of the council, he realized that refusing would only dig him deeper into a conflict he could not possibly win. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in his chest. Anger at being forced into a display of humility, and a dawning recognition that perhaps such humility was precisely what he had lacked for so many years. Weighing his options, he recalled the guard's stoic resolve, the unwavering decorum that refused to bend or retaliate even when subjected to demeaning treatment, and a flicker of respect for the discipline made him hesitate. The memory of the guard's resolute silence stood in stark contrast to the tourist's own outbursts, and an unfamiliar pang of shame pricked at his conscience. In the hush, he swallowed his pride and, voice trembling slightly, murmured his acceptance of the terms, though his tone still carried echoes of reluctance. A messenger was promptly dispatched to retrieve the guard, so he could bear witness to what the kingdom hoped would be a moment of redemption rather than further antagonism. When the guard entered, dressed once again in his immaculate uniform, the tension in the hall ratcheted higher, and for a moment the two men locked eyes. The guards unreadable, the tourists uncertain, both aware that this confrontation had transcended the realm of a mere legal dispute. Clearing his throat, the royal figure announced that a ceremonial dais had been prepared in the adjoining courtyard, where the tourist's apology would be delivered before assembled witnesses, and that all present were to follow in an orderly procession. Apprehension surged through the tourist, but he had no alternative. He followed the guard captain, the council members, and the royal figure through the corridor that led to the courtyard, where a steady drizzle still fell from an iron-grey sky, reminiscent of the day's earlier storm. Lanterns and torches lit the courtyard's periphery, casting dancing shadows on the wet stone, while a throng of onlookers, palace staff, curious citizens, and even a few lingering foreign guests had gathered to observe the final chapter of this improbable spectacle. The guard, though maintaining composure, could not entirely mask the flicker of vulnerability that arose from standing in the same place where he had been spat upon, an echo that resonated through every crevice of memory. Climbing onto the low platform, the tourist paused, inhaling the cool, damp air, his heart hammering as he felt dozens of eyes on him, each waiting to see if his concession would be genuine. At a subtle nod from the royal figure, he began to speak, his voice uneven at first, an uncharacteristic tremble revealing that for once he was neither rehearsed nor in control. With effort, he recounted how he had come to the palace expecting his wealth to open every door, never imagining that he would be confronted by a tradition so unassailable that it could humble even the most privileged traveller. His voice cracked when he acknowledged spitting on the guard, an action he could no longer excuse as a mere lapse in judgment, but rather a window into the arrogance he had permitted to rule his life. A silent hush blanketed the courtyard as he swallowed a lump in his throat, realizing at last that no compensation could repair the moral wound if he clung to an unrepentant mindset. Gradually, his words took on the shape of an apology, less polished than the carefully curated statements he once issued through public relations firms, and more akin to an unvarnished confession of how his pride had led him astray. He forced himself to meet the guard's unwavering gaze, sensing that the man's silence was not born of contempt, but of profound discipline, and he quietly uttered a request for forgiveness, stating that he recognized how deeply he had offended not only a single individual, but an entire kingdom's ethos. At the guard captain's sign, palace drummers commenced a slow, steady beat, An ancient tradition meant to underscore moments of critical significance, the resonance of the drums echoing through the courtyard in a solemn cadence. Accompanied by that rhythmic pulse, the tourist knelt, pressing one knee to the wet stone, then the other, until he was bowed low in a gesture the kingdom reserved for only the most profound expressions of humility. An audible intake of breath swept through the onlookers, many of whom had never seen a wealthy foreigner submit so publicly, an admission that within these walls, respect for the monarchy's guard outweighed any personal claim to status. Rising slowly, tears mixing with the drizzle on his cheeks, he murmured that he had arranged a considerable donation toward the welfare of retired guards and the families of fallen ones, a tangible acknowledgement that his apology must go beyond mere words. The guard, summoned by a gentle nudge from the captain, stepped forward, standing before the tourist, who found himself staring at the meticulously polished boots of the very man he had so callously insulted. In a moment that seemed to freeze time, the guard extended his right hand, not in condemnation, but in acceptance of the apology, a silent affirmation that although the offence would never be forgotten, it would not be weaponized to perpetuate enmity. Something akin to relief shattered the tension in the tourist's chest as he met the guard's hand and rose to his feet, the drumming ceasing so abruptly that the echo of silence felt like a cascade of fresh air rushing into the courtyard. The royal figure then addressed those assembled, solemnly declaring that justice had been served by restoring the guard's honour and reminding all present that in this kingdom, wealth and hubris would always bow before the sanctity of duty. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing in warmth as citizens, courtiers, and staff alike recognized the significance of the moment. The monarchy's traditions had not been compromised, and an act of contrition had been achieved through moral introspection, however belated. Throughout the courtyard, lanterns and torches danced with renewed vigour, and though the drizzle still fell, it felt less oppressive now, as though the kingdom itself had exhaled a sigh of satisfaction that a necessary balance had been restored. The tourist, tears still fresh on his cheeks, sensed that something deep within him had shifted, a fracture in his once invincible worldview that now opened a doorway to humility, empathy, and an awareness that respect could not be bought. Adhering to protocol, palace officials escorted him back inside, though no longer under guard, but rather with a courteous distance that signalled he had moved from pariah to a man who, however flawed, had taken steps toward redemption. In a final gesture of mercy, the guard who had borne the insult offered the tourist his own ceremonial handkerchief to dry his face, a silent but powerful act that reaffirmed the kingdom's values of reconciliation over retribution. Over the subsequent days, whispers of the incident circulated far and wide, with many visitors lauding the palace for upholding an ancient code without yielding to the seduction of international wealth or influence, and others marvelling at how a single act of contrition could alter one man's destiny. For his part, the tourist, no longer haughty and dismissive, stayed on in the kingdom for a time, quietly fulfilling his pledge to fund programs supporting the royal guard, forging unexpected friendships with local citizens, and deepening his understanding of a culture that placed dignity above all else. Each morning, he woke to the grandeur of a realm that had once been a mere backdrop for his conquests, but was now a place of profound transformation, where he learned that humility, respect, and character might surpass the fleeting power of a swollen bank account. The guard, too, found himself reflecting on that day, not with bitterness but with a guarded hope that perhaps even those who appeared irredeemably arrogant could learn to honour centuries of tradition if confronted by justice imbued with patience and empathy. In the end, the monarchy's unwavering stance had upheld its cherished ideals, reaffirming the guard's worth and heralding a future in which wealth could no longer be mistaken for moral authority within these ancient walls. And so, after one of the most scandalous episodes in the palace's memory, both the guard and the tourist emerged forever changed. One assured of the kingdom's commitment to his honour, The other awakened to the possibility that true nobility might be found in servitude and respect rather than in privilege and pride. As the tourist departed at last, bowing respectfully to the guard and the palace officials, he left behind him not just a generous endowment, but a legacy of learning, a testimony that in a world defined by fleeting shows of power, there remained a place where intangible virtues prevailed. And though his footprints soon faded from the marbled steps, the story of the day he spat on a royal guard and what transpired next became a timeless parable about the unbreakable armor of respect, the redemptive possibility of humility, and the unforgettable power of a kingdom's unwavering devotion to its heritage.